further ado, I'd like to introduce Fred. Give him a big round of applause. Thank you.
All right, my name is Freddie B. I'm an addict.
Hey, Fred.
John, thank you so much for inviting us, and thank you so much for inviting me to share. I was a little nervous coming up. It's been a while since I've spoken anywhere or done any type of engagement like this, but I prayed last night. I told God, I said, God, please use me as a vessel. Let me just share my experience, strength, and hope, and hopefully inspire somebody. So I'd like to qualify first, and I'll kind of sprinkle in the powerlessness, kind of throughout my story, right? I'm originally from Tampa, Florida. Started, using drugs and alcohol at the age of 10, right? I started smoking weed. I started, drinking, and things started progressing fairly quickly, or early on in my life, right? And it even showed beforehand, before the substances were involved, with just my behavior, my thought process, my false belief systems on what I thought was cool or what I thought was a man and things like that. I grew up in an Italian household, and that kind of played into my ego. That played into the person, the monster that I was becoming, right? And I started that path very early on, right? I started working the streets. I dropped out of school in the 6th grade, right? I didn't step foot inside of high school, nothing. Through the course of my early teenage years, I had my first daughter when I was 15. So I was a baby having babies, right? And I was scared. I didn't know what to do, right? I was in an alternative school because I got kicked out. I got, the mother of my kids now. I got pregnant. I didn't know, right? I'm just trying to navigate life. And that was probably some of the most challenging times in my life early on, right? Was me not knowing what I was doing, or not knowing, I was involving myself in adult behaviors without knowing the consequence. Now the reward, right? Back then it was a consequence and something negative. Now it's a blessing. But I was going through these challenges at a very young age, right? And my thought process is really when I noticed that I was powerless over, right? I was powerless over my emotions and my feelings. I had anger outbursts, right? I was in a mental hospital multiple times than I could count. I was in, I got arrested multiple times than I could count. It was very challenging, right? A lot of arrests, a lot of possession charges, a lot of battery charges. Kind of fast forward a little bit, 2 years later I had my second daughter, right? Another scary thing, right? I had my first daughter when I was 15, my second daughter at 17. At this point, I think I'm working at a public supermarket and at a grocery store, and that was my ambition, right? That was my goal, to become a manager, put money in a 401k while I was doing drugs and try to provide for my family. And the course of the progression, right? I call it, people have a bucket list, right? I call it the fuck it list. I say fuck it, I'm never gonna do it, and I say fuck it, and I do it, right? I said I was never gonna do cocaine, I was never gonna do ecstasy, I was never gonna do heroin, I was never gonna do meth. Eventually, at a certain point, my powerlessness became overwhelming, and I couldn't control what I was doing, and I just said fuck it, and I started checking those things off. And that's where my disease kind of took a turn, right? When I started drinking, I just started saying fuck it. I kept having these behavior things going on. I had multiple arrests, kind of throughout that time. Again, like I said, possession charges and mainly battery charges. My last big arrest was battery on a law enforcement officer and threatening a public servant. Right? I was out of my mind. I was in psychosis and threatening my neighbors, and again, going back to that, I was emotionally dysregulated, right? I couldn't deal with my feelings and emotions. I was, trying to fill a void within inside myself. And, that was the last big one, right? So I was looking at 10 or 15 years because I had prior possession charges before that. I was supposed to be on drug diversion and X, Y, and Z, all the things that we go through. And in the course of me getting arrested for that felony, I was supposed to do like a urine sample, right? I was doing a urine sample. And this is how God was working in my life before I even acknowledged it, right? Was Father's Day of 2013. Me and my ex had a horrible relationship. anger, fighting. We didn't live together, right? I'm 17, almost. I think I was 18 at the time, actually. We're separated. I'm trying to see the kids. I'm trying to make it work. I'm getting high. Cocaine was my main substance of choice, and Xanax. So I was on this like combination of this up and down, up and down, up and down. And the point that led me up to like actually seeking treatment and seeking the recovery was Father's Day of 2013. I overdosed. Just completely, eyes rolled back to my head. Father's Day, I tried to stay sober my entire day to see my kids. Like that was my goal. It was like, I'm gonna stay clean and sober. I'm not gonna use, I'm not gonna drink in order to see my kids. I kept calling my ex. She didn't answer. Finally at night, I just said, fuck it. All the drugs that I was gonna do in the day, I did them in like a 2-hour time span. A lot of things at once. I was writing suicide notes, right? That was my goal. It was like I didn't want to live anymore because I couldn't see my kids. I was this young kid. I just felt like the world was spiraling. I truly felt powerless in that moment. And I put a gun in my head multiple times and pulled the trigger, knowing that there wasn't a bullet in the chamber, but just like hoping, just hoping there was, right? And that's where like my disease of addiction and my thought process was at that time, Anyways, long story short, I overdosed, and I went to the mental hospital, right? They found the suicide note. They found, thank God they didn't find anything else, right? My mom saved my ass multiple times, but instead of taking me to jail, they took me to the mental hospital, which was a blessing, right? Because Monday, I was supposed to go see probation and actually do a urine screen. If I would have done that, then worse things would have happened. So I went into this hospital, I'm like, dazed and confused. I don't know what the fuck's happening, tunnel vision. I wake up, paramedics, I'm strapped up, I'm like locked up to the bed. So I'm like ripping out IVs, blood's everywhere. And again, I got admitted. And at that point, I knew that I needed to make a change. So I'm in this mental hospital for a week. It's my first ever time being at like this adult insane asylum in Tampa, Florida. Right? Not a place you want to, you don't want to visit those places. Not a fun place. I had a guy like in the corner talking to Smurfs, and it was just wild. Right? It was wild. I'm like, I don't want to be here. But I did because God saved me from like potential prison time and jail and like a lot more heartache. So in the course of this, I fell in love in the mental hospital, right? I found a beautiful woman that was in the army. She was, again, the powerlessness of women and drugs and video games and all of it, right? It's manifested in my life throughout this entire time, right? And I found this police officer, army, beautiful woman. She might have been from Charleston, South Carolina, I don't know, but she was great. She was a little Southern belle, she was phenomenal. And I was like, I'm in love. I'm right where I can be, And, she helped me kind of get through some of that time. I had somebody to talk to that was kind of normal, and I was like, this is a God shot. She's a police officer in the army. I'm a drug addict and almost a felon. This is a match made in heaven, right? That's the insanity of my thought process, right? This 18-year-old kid weighing 120 pounds soaking wet. I kept seeing this commercial online, or we're watching TV. It was like the playoffs. I think it was Miami versus somebody basketball, and I keep seeing this commercial. Big treatment center out in California. My ego is so inflated that I'm like, oh, that's a celebrity rehab that I need to go to. They cure you, we're good. So I went to that place, and again, that's where my like ego took me. Was like, I need to get like to that celebrity rehab place to like arrive, right? Which was like a crazy thought. In the course of that, right, I went to treatment. I was in that mental hospital for a week. I got out, flew out, and I flew to California, right? I was supposed to be out there 30 days. Of course, I fell in love again, because love was my second addiction, right? Like, all of it, right? So I fell in love in rehab. We moved into a sober living together. We relapsed. I went back to the sober living, fell in love with another girl. Eventually ended up in San Francisco getting high in the Tenderloin. And I always say this joke, right? Like, my disease of addiction took me to depths that I never thought was achievable in my life, right? Again, that bucket list just became worse and worse and worse. You know, that was the, I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready for recovery. I didn't understand the disease of addiction. I didn't understand that it lied in my thought process and my behaviors and the way I maneuver around life, right? I thought a drug addict was somebody that had a needle in their arm, that was homeless. Like, that wasn't my story, so like I couldn't relate with those people. You know, and then once I understood the disease of addiction is I'm at dis-ease with myself, right? My old sponsor broke that down to me. He's like, what does disease mean? And I gave him some 18-year-old response, my arrogant ass, and I was like, this and that. He's like, no, you're at dis-ease with yourself, right? And I was trying to fill that void because I was so powerlessness that I was trying to hold on to something. You know, whether it was the relationship or the drugs or the false belief system of my life at the time. You know, so I went there, I ended up getting high in San Francisco, and like, I ended up smoking birth control, right? That's like where my disease took me. I felt really emotional that night, really touching my feelings, a lot of estrogen flowing. You know, that's the type of shit that like I did, you know, because I got ripped off by a homeless person in the Tenderloin in San Francisco, which is like just horrible, right? And I had this big scheme, right? I'm out of my goddamn mind, smoking meth here, all the shit that we do, right? And I had no money, my parents cut me off. My biggest scam was to fall down some stairs in San Francisco to try to sue somebody, and or buy scratcher tickets and then cut the box and put the right numbers on the corresponding ticket. Not realizing there's a barcode on the back, right? Like the insanity, the powerlessness, right, all of it. So, you know, fast forward a little bit, you know, my family cut me off. I went back to treatment. I really want to get into some solution here. I know I've been kind of talking about I just want to qualify. I qualify. I'm qualified. I think I am. You know, a lot of my friends show say you're not an addict. You drink a little bit too hard on weekends. You know, I'm like, I went through some shit. I went back to treatment, and that's where I found the rooms of Bend. Right? Again, I didn't know the difference. I knew that other fellowships, I had trouble reading, right? I still do. I feel like I'm dyslexic. I feel like I got speech impediment. You know, I got all the excuses, right? 6th grade education. But it was hard for me to read some of the other literature and some of the other fellowships, and I give credit to those fellowships because they've let other fellowships branch off from there. But NA is where I found my recovery. Basic text, easy for me to read. You know, it was a simple process. Not a simple process. It was a simple read for me, and the process, is what I needed. And the consistency that I found within the rooms, right? I went to 2 to 3 meetings a week or a day for my first 2 years, right? I really dedicated my life to this, early on to just try to have the best shot of something. And the powerlessness at the time, right? I hadn't seen my kids for 3 years. When I moved to California, my oldest daughter was going to be 1 3 days before my youngest daughter was going to be 1 3 days before I moved to California. My oldest daughter was going to, coming up on 2.5, 3, I think, and that was what I do it for, right? I do it for them. And, again, that powerless theme, played a big role in my early recovery, but I didn't give up, right? I just persevered and I kept fucking going. I said, I'm going to build my life into something that I didn't want or deserve before I came into the rooms. Because I didn't want this, right? They say, you have a life beyond your wildest dreams. My wildest dreams, a lot of strippers, a lot of cocaine, shit that just wasn't cohesive with a normal process of life, right? Now I have a life I didn't want or deserve, but I'm so grateful that I have it, Today I own and run multiple companies. I've done a lot in the industry over my decade career. Has been in the treatment space out in California. I have a beautiful wife that I've met while working in treatment, while being in recovery, while just being a good person. Right, I'm a good human being. I give as much as I can. I put myself in the back burner to make sure everybody else is good. I got 2 of my colleagues, Austin and Glenn, is here, 2 of my best friends. They've been riding with me for 10 years and 5 years. I've always shared and just brought them into whatever I could. So it takes time, right? It's a natural progression, right? I always say this: you can have one scenario, one situation, and you can look at it, 1 from a negative light and have a negative result, or 2 a positive light and have a positive result. You know, you can have a car accident, you can say, fuck, you know, this piece of shit cut me off, and I hate this day, and this and that. Or you could say, you know what, thank God nobody got hurt. You could say, thank God I got insurance. You know, thank God, everybody's fine. So it's really about perspective for me that really regained that power back in my life, right? And you have to watch it, right? Because you don't want that to creep into ego or think you know some shit, right? Like, I try to remain as humble as possible in my day-to-day actions, right? And given the roles that I played in life and the CEO titles and the ownership titles, right? I still lean on people for advice, right? And I've had great mentors over the years, both in recovery and both in business, that have helped like transform my life into something that I couldn't have like dreamt this, right? I couldn't have done this on my own, right? I put in a lot of work. I listen to a lot of Tony Robbins, right? I'm in these board meetings with doctors early on and you know, treatment spaces, and I'm like, fuck, I'm in 6th grade education. I don't have what it takes, right? Like these people aren't gonna listen to me. I'm yelling at myself on the 405 and the rearview mirror, pumping myself up to make sure that I speak eloquently, that I speak effectively, that I communicate appropriately to these people and help the clients at the time that I was servicing, right, as a case manager. So, you know, my life has been amazing. You know, I'm still a work in progress. You know, just I know I've probably been speaking for a little while now. Just to kind of fast forward to the last, you know, this past year, right? This past year in my journey has been one of the most challenging years of my life, right? I've been questioning myself, right? I made some bad business decisions. I lost some money, right? I lost some of the financial aspects that kind of kept me in a very comfortable place. But through uncomfortability lies growth, right? And in that growth the last year, even of the stuff that I felt like's going wrong, that's not fully gone wrong yet. But I've learned a lot, right? And I've expanded, you know, some of the heartache, and now I have that experience to like move and operate in different fashions now, right? And share that experience with other people. You know, family stuff going on. My mother-in-law got diagnosed with cancer. I had to fly to Florida for 2 weeks with my whole entire family, right? I got 2 younger kids too. My 2 older kids, right? My oldest is 15, my second oldest is 13. They live up in Portland, so I fly up there from California very frequently. I get to show up for them. You know, I got to take my oldest one to her first what's the freshman in the dances? Homecoming. You know, I got to fly up there, right? Like, I get to show up for my kids today. I get to show up for my ex. I have an amazing relationship with her. I actually had to go up there and do like a little intervention with her because she was drinking too much. I showed up unannounced. I jumped on a flight. I said, look, this is not okay. We had an emotional, you know, conversation, and she started doing a little bit better, right? I get to show up for my kids because nobody else is making their life special other than dad. You know, I got to go up there. My daughter didn't want to dress up in a dress, right? So I bought her some Jordan 4s. I bought her friends some Jordan 4s. I said, baby, we're gonna get you a nice sparkly dress and the shoes to match with it, you know? So it's the things like that that have brought my life just like full circle, right? My oldest daughter too, right? Smoked a little weed recently, drank a little alcohol, was having sex at the age of 15, right? The same age that I was doing my shit. I fucking flew up there at a 12-hour notice, did an intervention on her, ambushed her, and now she's living with me in California. I said, we're gonna set a higher standard of life than what you've been exposed to, right? Because I built this person, and I want my kids to be a reflection of what I've built, you know? And I'm not perfect, I just do the best that I can on a daily basis to like make sure my family's good. You know, that's the biggest thing in my life. I was really, it gets me emotional talking about this because it was the exact same path that I took. She wasn't as bad as I was, but you know, we were doing this whole intervention, and I told her, I said, you were the first reason why I got clean and sober. You know, and it's hard, right? It's hard. Watching an image, you know, your twin at the age that you had her at, do similar things that you were doing, and maybe a little bit of a less fashion, but still a fashion that I don't want her operating in. So now she's living with dad, she hates it. I got her in school, right? I was navigating all this the last like 3 weeks. Like, I had to get transcripts. This is the crazy part too, I was never on their birth certificate. So technically, like, the the challenges that I faced over the last couple of weeks and the last couple of months, I had to get an attorney. I had to, you know, again, God in recovery has taught me just to show up and do the right things, and good things happen. You know, so I had to like submit all these documents for old school and get all these things, and you know, at that point I felt powerless. You know, but thank God I put in the footwork months previous where I said, you know what, I'm not allowed to go to school up there in Portland, but I'll send you our court documents. I built a great, you know, I'm a networking guy. I built a great relationship with a counselor up there at a 5-minute phone call. She's like, I'm gonna help you, right? She sent me the transcript, she sent me the vaccination records. I got my daughter enrolled in school, right? It was like, it felt like such a relief, and thank God I have the availability and flexibility to do these things and show up, right? And just be consistent, be that consistent role model. You know, and you know, I got 2 other little babies. I got 3 girls, and I finally had a little Freddie Jr., and it's just a beautiful life. You know, it's a good quality of life. You know, I don't have everything that I want, but I have everything that I need right now. You know, I get to go home to my babies every day. I get to, you know, it's hard for me to be away from them right now, but I get to pick up my daughter from high school and be like, baby, how was your day? You know, because her mom wasn't checking in with her. I check in, I'm all up in her shit, but she hates it. You know, I'm like, who you texted me? Okay, who's that? Who's Carla? Okay, all right, we got this. You know, she knows I'm a little crazy, so, you know, but it's an amazing life that I've built, and like, I see this to be inspiring, like, not arrogance at all, right? I've built companies on my back, I brought friends involved to like things that I was doing to like, just share whatever I could with them. And I say that because like, I shouldn't have been doing those things. You know, I should not have been doing those things. If you saw my life 12 years ago, right, it was day and night difference, the way I operated, the way I talked, and so forth and so on. You guys spoke for over 20 minutes, so yeah. Sorry, yeah, I didn't mean to hijack the last 30 minutes of your guys' life, but I appreciate everything that I have today, and you know, you guys know Never Alone Recovery. I appreciate all of you guys being involved in this, and the sponsors and everything else. I'll end on this, you know. Life's not easy. It does get easier. Sometimes there's ups and downs. You know, I always say I'm highly stressed. I'm highly blessed. You know, that's all I got. Thank you.